Imagine a world where your marriage, your very identity, could be ripped away, not by your choice, but by the whims of men, the rigidity of the church, or the whispers of society. A world where, once divorced, your name was dragged through the mud, your future shattered, and your existence marked by an indelible stain of shame. What if this wasn't some distant fantasy, but the harsh reality for countless women in the year 1205? Number 1. Physical abuse or cruelty leading to separation. In the year 1205, the concept of a full, irrevocable divorce as we understand it today was largely a distant dream, especially for women seeking to escape a tyrannical marriage. The powerful grip of the Catholic Church, wielding immense authority over all aspects of life, including the sacred institution of marriage, meant that once two people were wed, their union was considered indissoluble, a holy sacrament forged by God Himself. Yet the brutal realities of human nature, particularly in a society where men held almost absolute power, often clashed violently with this divine ideal. When a woman's very life was threatened by the relentless cruelty of her husband, when her body bore the constant scars of his rage, there existed a glimmer, a tiny sliver of hope, for a legal separation, known as a separation mensa et thoro, from bed and board. This was not a true annulment that allowed remarriage. It was merely a sanctioned escape from cohabitation, a desperate plea for safety. Seeking such a separation was an uphill battle, fraught with peril and almost guaranteed to plunge a woman into the deepest pits of public shame. Consider Elara, a woman in her early 20s, living in a bustling market town in the heart of France. Her marriage to Lord Geoffroy had begun with the usual hopes and prayers, a union arranged to solidify landholdings and elevate family status, but those hopes quickly soured. Geoffroy, a man of volatile temperament and a quick temper, saw his wife not as a partner but as a possession, someone to be controlled and increasingly punished. His blows began subtly, a cuff across the ear for a perceived slight, a shove for a clumsy step. Soon they escalated. Elara's arm often bore purple bruises hidden beneath long sleeves, her lips split more times than she could count. She lived in constant fear, her heart a frantic drumbeat whenever Geoffroy's heavy footsteps approached. Her household staff, her few remaining servants, saw the signs, the averted gaze, the flinching, the way she moved as if her bones were brittle, but they dared not speak. Interfere in a lord's household matters, especially his treatment of his wife, was to invite his wrath. Elara's decision to seek separation was not made lightly. It was born of sheer desperation, a primal need for survival. One night, after a particularly brutal beating that left her barely conscious, her ribs aching with every shallow breath, she knew she could not endure another moment. She confided in her confessor, a kindly but cautious priest, Brother Thomas. He listened, his face etched with sorrow and unease. He explained the monumental task ahead of her. Prove physical abuse sufficient for separation, Elara would need witnesses, something incredibly difficult to secure when servants feared their master's retribution. She would have to present her broken body, her visible injuries, to a court of men, often cold and skeptical. And even then, they would weigh her claims against the prevailing societal view that a husband had the right to correct his wife, to enforce his will, even with physical force. A woman's disobedience was often seen as the cause of her husband's justifiable anger. Brother Thomas, against his own better judgment and risking his own standing, helped Elara compile her case. She appeared before the local ecclesiastical court, a somber chamber filled with robed clerics and stern-faced judges. The air was thick with judgment. Elara, trembling but resolute, recounted the beatings, the verbal abuse, the constant terror. She lifted her sleeves, revealing the fading but unmistakable bruises. She described the crippling pain in her chest, the lingering dizziness from head injuries. Her husband, Lord Geoffroy, sat opposite her, sneering, denying everything, portraying her as a hysterical, disobedient wife who exaggerated minor domestic disagreements. He had his own witnesses, loyal retainers who swore they had never seen their lord raise a hand in malice, attributing Elara's complaints to her delicate constitution and her unruly tongue. The shame Elara endured during this process was soul-crushing. Every whispered word from the spectators, every skeptical glance from the judges, felt like a branding iron on her skin. She was seen not as a victim, but as a disruptive force, a woman who dared to challenge her husband's authority, a disloyal wife who aired her marital grievances in public. Her reputation, once untarnished, was now irrevocably tarnished. Neighbors, once friendly, now averted their eyes or offered pitying glances that felt worse than condemnation. Her family, particularly her male relatives, were mortified. Father, fearing a loss of family honor and influence, initially tried to persuade her to return to Geoffroy, to make peace, to bear her cross. He saw her refusal to endure the violence as a failure of her wifely duties, not a cry for help. Even if Elara won her separation, the outcome was bleak. She would be granted the right to live apart from Geoffroy, perhaps in a convent or with a sympathetic relative, but she could never remarry. Her status was akin to that of a widow, but without the respect or the relative freedom that widowhood sometimes afforded. She would lose access to her dowry, which would likely remain under Geoffroy's control or be tied up in endless legal battles. She would be perpetually dependent, without the protection or standing of a husband. Any children she had would almost certainly remain with Geoffroy, the father, leaving her heartbroken and isolated. Her life would be one of quiet subsistence, forever marked by the scandal of her public separation, a stark testament to the unforgiving nature of medieval society for a woman who dared to challenge her lot, even when facing mortal danger. The shame clung to her like a shroud, suffocating her spirit, even as it saved her life. She was separated from her tormentor, yes, but also from the very fabric of respected society. Number 2, heresy or apostasy. In 1205, the scent of burning heretics was not uncommon in the air across Europe. The Catholic Church, then at the zenith of its power, viewed deviations from its doctrines not merely as spiritual errors, but as grave threats to the very foundations of society and the souls of its faithful. To be accused of heresy or apostasy, the abandonment of one's religious beliefs, was to invite the full, terrifying wrath of ecclesiastical authorities. For a woman, such an accusation not only imperiled her immortal soul and her very life, but also had devastating consequences for her marriage, often leading to a complete and utter dissolution, a form of spiritual divorce that left her utterly destitute and profoundly shamed. Consider the case of Isolde, a woman from Languedoc, a region in southern France famously riddled with the Cathar movement, a group deemed heretical by the Church. Isolde was born into a family that, like many in the region, quietly held some sympathy for the Cathar teachings, which emphasized a dualistic view of the world, a good God and an evil God, and a rejection of the material world. While she attended Mass and outwardly conformed to Catholic rites, she secretly cherished the simpler, more ascetic principles she heard discussed in hushed tones among her relatives. She believed in the importance of spiritual purity, in living a life free from worldly corruption, and found comfort in the idea of the perfects, the Cathar spiritual leaders, who lived lives of profound simplicity and poverty. Isolde married a prosperous merchant, Lord Gerard, a devout Catholic with no tolerance for what he considered dangerous deviations from the true faith. For years, Isolde carefully concealed her inner beliefs, attending church ceremonies with her husband, participating in rituals, and raising their children in the accepted faith. The weight of her secret grew heavy, and she sometimes allowed veiled comments to slip, questioning the opulence of the church or the authority of its priests. Her husband, initially dismissing these as typical feminine musings, eventually grew suspicious. He began to observe her more closely, noting her absence from certain church festivals, her quiet contemplation of simpler, unadorned prayer books, her occasional meetings with an old aunt known to harbor Cathar leanings. The moment of truth arrived when a fervent Dominican inquisitor, Brother Raymond, arrived in their town, tasked with rooting out heresy. Gerard, perhaps out of genuine concern for his wife's soul, perhaps fearing the taint of heresy on his own family and business, or perhaps even out of a cold desire to rid himself of a wife whose questioning nature had become inconvenient, reported his suspicions to the authorities. Isolde was immediately seized and brought before Brother Raymond and his tribunal. The interrogation was a terrifying ordeal. Isolde was pressed to confess her beliefs, to recant, to name others. Carefully constructed facade crumbled under the relentless questioning. She found herself unable to deny the spiritual pull of the Cathar message, even as she trembled with fear. Her subtle admissions, her hesitation to denounce Cathar tenets outright, were enough. She was declared a heretic. The shame was immediate and absolute. Her marriage to Gerard was instantly declared null and void by the Church. The union with a heretic was an abomination, a defilement of the sacred sacrament. She was not merely divorced, she was excommunicated, cast out from the Christian community and declared a danger to all around her. Children, though considered legitimate, were now tainted by her association, and she lost all rights to them. Her dowry, once her only potential safety net, was confiscated by the church or reverted to her husband, who was praised for his vigilance in identifying and exposing her heresy. Isolde was publicly shamed in the town square. She was paraded through the streets, dressed in a San Benito, a yellow tunic marked with crosses, a visual sign of her condemnation. Her name was cursed, her very existence vilified. People who once greeted her warmly now spat at her or recoiled in disgust. Her friends avoided her, fearing guilt by association. She was isolated, stripped of her identity, her family, and her future. The ultimate fate for a declared heretic was often imprisonment, forced penance, or, in the most extreme cases, the pyre. Isolde's life, once stable and respectable, was shattered beyond recognition. She was not just divorced, she was erased from the social landscape, a cautionary tale of the dire consequences of spiritual descent in a world where belief was life, and deviation was death. Her very being became a source of profound, unforgiving societal shame. Number 3. Adultery. In the early 13th century, the bonds of matrimony, while considered unbreakable by the church, were often tested by the very human desires and failings that transcended societal norms. While divorce in the modern sense was rare, adultery, particularly on the part of the wife, was a profoundly serious offense. It was not a ground for a full annulment that would allow a husband to remarry, as the church upheld the permanence of the marriage bond. However, it was a universally accepted and vigorously pursued reason for a separation, a mensa et thoro, from bed and board, and would inflict devastating, inescapable shame upon the woman involved. The legal repercussions were severe, but the social consequences were often far more brutal, leaving the woman utterly ruined. Imagine the bustling port city of Bruges, a hub of trade and wealth, in 1205. Lady Isabelle, the wife of a prosperous wool merchant, Sir Roland, lived a life of relative comfort. Her days were filled with supervising her household, overseeing servants, and raising her children, but her marriage, while financially secure, lacked warmth. Sir Roland was often away on lengthy trading voyages, his attention consumed by business and profit. Isabelle, left alone in her opulent home, longed for connection, for affection that her busy husband rarely provided. It was in this emotional void that she met a charming young apprentice, a weaver named Antoine, whose bright eyes and poetic words offered a stark contrast to Roland's pragmatic demeanor. The clandestine affair began subtly, a shared glance, a whispered word, escalating into secret meetings in secluded corners of the city or late-night rendezvous within the merchant's house when Roland was away. Isabelle, perhaps naive, perhaps desperate for human connection, believed their secret was safe. Secrets, especially those concerning illicit love, rarely remain hidden in close-knit medieval communities. Servants, ever vigilant, noticed Antoine's lingering presence, his furtive entries and exits. Neighbors, quick to judge and slow to forgive, observed Isabelle's newfound lightness, her uncharacteristic smiles. Whispers began to circulate, hushed at first, then growing louder, culminating in a direct report to Sir Roland upon his return from a long voyage. Sir Roland, a man of considerable standing, was consumed by a fury that threatened to rip his very being apart. Adultery on the part of a wife was not merely a betrayal of marital vows. It was a profound attack on a husband's honor, a challenge to his authority, and most critically, a threat to the legitimacy of his heirs. In a society where inheritance and lineage were paramount, the possibility of a child not being his own was an unbearable indignity. He immediately brought the matter before the local ecclesiastical court, a body that handled cases touching upon the sanctity of marriage. Trial was a public spectacle designed to humble and punish the accused. Isabelle was forced to face her husband's accusations, the damning testimonies of servants who had observed her indiscretion, and the palpable judgment of the entire community. Her carefully maintained reputation was systematically dismantled. Sir Roland, presenting a powerful case of betrayal, demanded not only a separation from bed and board, but also the return of Isabelle's dowry and the formal declaration that any children born after the affair began were illegitimate, even though they might physically resemble him. The court, bound by canon law, swiftly ruled in his favor. The shame Isabelle endured was absolute and all-encompassing. She was publicly denounced as an adulteress, a term that carried immense social stigma. Her name became synonymous with moral decay. Children who, by the court's decree, remained with their father were forbidden from seeing her, lest they be corrupted by her presence. Her own family, deeply embarrassed by the scandal, often disowned her or offered only the most begrudging and isolated support. A woman separated for adultery was stripped of her social standing, her economic means, and her very dignity. She lost her status as a wife, but gained no new one. She became an outcast, a pariah. She would be forced to live out her days in virtual seclusion, often in a convent under strict penance, or banished to a remote family estate, utterly dependent on charity or the distant mercy of relatives. She could never remarry, her marital bond technically still in place, but practically a living death. Her reputation was in tatters, her name a byword for perfidy. She was a woman who had dared to transgress the rigid boundaries of female chastity and loyalty, and society exacted a terrible, unforgiving price. The shame of adultery in 1205 was not just a fleeting embarrassment. It was a lifelong sentence, a brand that seared deep into a woman's soul, isolating her forever from the respect and acceptance of her community. Number 4. Lack of consent or coercion. In 1205, the concept of consent, especially for women, was a nuanced and often overlooked aspect of marital law. While the church technically maintained that a marriage, to be valid, required the free and mutual consent of both parties, the reality on the ground was far different. Marriages were primarily economic and social alliances, arranged by families for strategic purposes, to consolidate land, secure inheritances, forge alliances, or climb the social ladder. Young women, particularly those of noble or wealthy merchant families, often had little to no say in the choice of their spouse. If a woman could prove she was coerced into marriage, that her consent was not freely given, she could seek an annulment. However, gathering such proof was immensely difficult, and the very act of challenging her family's will and publicly declaring coercion brought with it a heavy burden of social shame and the risk of being seen as rebellious, difficult, or even unchaste. Consider the predicament of Lady Agnes, a young woman from a powerful baronial family in England. From her earliest childhood, she had been groomed for a strategic marriage. At the age of 15, she was betrothed to Lord Richard, a man significantly older than herself, known for his harsh temper and ambitious nature. Richard's lands bordered those of Agnes's family, and their union would create a formidable estate, securing a critical defensive line. Agnes herself was terrified. She had heard whispers of Richard's cruelty, of his previous wife, who had died under mysterious circumstances, and of his brutal treatment of his servants. She pleaded with her father, weeping, begging him not to force her into this union. Her father, a stern and unyielding man, scoffed at her pleas. "This is for the family's future, girl," he declared, his voice cold. "Your feelings are of no consequence. Your duty is to obey." He threatened to disinherit her, to send her to a strict convent for the rest of her days, to shame her family name if she dared defy him. He used psychological pressure, emotional manipulation, and even physical intimidation, locking her in her chambers, denying her food until she relented. Under duress, isolated and terrified, Agnes finally whispered the vows during the ceremony, her heart a leaden weight in her chest, her voice barely audible. Her consent was not freely given, it was extracted under duress. Months into her marriage, Agnes found herself living a nightmare. Richard's cruelty was even worse than the rumors had suggested. He was verbally abusive, emotionally distant, and physically violent. Agnes, increasingly desperate, confided in a sympathetic priest, Father Gregory, who understood that true consent was the bedrock of a valid sacrament. He advised her that she might have grounds for an annulment if she could prove that her consent was given under coercion, that she had been forced into the marriage against her true will. The process was arduous and humiliating. Agnes had to present her case to the ecclesiastical court, detailing the threats her father had made, the emotional torment she had endured, the physical intimidation. This meant publicly denouncing her own family, specifically her powerful father, who would naturally deny all accusations and present a united front against her. Father, furious at her defiance, testified that she was a willful and disobedient daughter, prone to fits of fancy, and that her claims were simply a rebellious attempt to escape her marital duties. Richard, her husband, portrayed himself as an innocent party, a man whose honor was being unjustly attacked. The shame for Agnes was multifaceted. She was seen as ungrateful and rebellious for defying her family's wishes. She was painted as untrustworthy for trying to escape a marriage already solemnized. Her reputation for meekness and obedience, qualities highly prized in women, was shattered. People whispered that she must be hiding something, that she was perhaps unchaste or seeking a more advantageous union if she was so desperate to escape this one. The fact that she was challenging the authority of her father and her husband, two of the most powerful male figures in her life, was an act of profound social transgression. Even if Agnes successfully obtained an annulment, a long, drawn-out, and expensive process that often favored powerful families, her future remained uncertain. While an annulment meant the marriage was deemed never to have existed, restoring her technical right to marry someone else, her social standing would be forever tainted. She would be seen as damaged goods, a woman who had been involved in a scandalous public dispute, a woman who had dared to speak out against her family. Prospects for a future marriage, especially a good one, would be severely diminished. She might be forced into a nunnery or relegated to a life of dependence on reluctant relatives. Her attempt to gain freedom, to escape a terrible marriage, paradoxically bound her to a life of public scrutiny and profound private shame, a scarlet letter of defiance in a world that demanded quiet submission from its women. Number 5. Consanguinity or affinity, forbidden degrees of kinship. In the year 1205, the vast web of kinship, both by blood and by marriage, was a powerful force in medieval society. Marriage was often a means of consolidating family power, expanding landholdings, and forging strategic alliances. However, the Church, in its zealous effort to regulate morality and prevent what it deemed incestuous unions, had established increasingly elaborate rules regarding forbidden degrees of kinship, known as consanguinity, blood relation, and affinity, relation by marriage. Marrying within these prohibited degrees, sometimes as distant as the 7th degree of kinship, was a major ground for annulment. While this rule was often used as a convenient loophole by powerful families to dissolve inconvenient marriages, for the woman involved, it could lead to profound shame, even if she was entirely ignorant of the forbidden connection. Consider the tragic case of Lady Elara, a young noblewoman from a powerful German principality. Her marriage to Lord Ulrich, a formidable and ambitious baron from a neighboring territory, was a pinnacle of dynastic ambition. The union united two significant landholdings and was celebrated with great pomp and fanfare. Elara, barely 18, entered the marriage with dutiful obedience, her life trajectory set by her family's strategic vision. For several years, their marriage seemed stable, producing two healthy children, a son and a daughter, securing the lineage. However, as often happened in medieval power struggles, alliances shifted. Lord Ulrich's political ambitions began to clash with those of Elara's family. What was once a beneficial union suddenly became a hindrance, a liability. Conveniently, at this very moment, a meticulous genealogist in Ulrich's employ, or perhaps an opportunistic rival, unearthed a startling discovery. A distant, almost forgotten common ancestor between Elara and Ulrich, placing them within the prohibited degrees of consanguinity according to canon law. Perhaps it was a great-great-grandmother on one side, who was also a great-great-aunt on the other, a connection so remote that it had been entirely unknown to the families themselves for generations. Lord Ulrich, seizing this opportune revelation, immediately petitioned the ecclesiastical court for an annulment of his marriage to Elara. The petition was framed not as a desire to abandon his wife, but as a pious necessity, an act of obedience to God's law, to rectify a union that was, in the eyes of the Church, an abomination. Children, despite being born of a marriage believed valid, would be deemed illegitimate by the annulment, a severe consequence, but often acceptable if the annulment served a greater political purpose for the father's family. Elara was utterly blindsided. She had lived her life according to the rules, performing her duties as a wife and mother. To be told that her marriage, her very union, was essentially incestuous, in the eyes of the Church was horrifying. She was dragged before the court, not as a wrongdoer in the conventional sense, but as a participant in a forbidden act, even if unknowingly. Parents, too, faced scrutiny and potential shame for having arranged such a marriage, though the blame would invariably fall heaviest upon the woman, who was seen as the vessel of the forbidden union. The shame for Elara was profound. She was branded not with guilt for her actions, but with the stain of an unnatural marriage. People whispered about the incestuous union, even if the connection was incredibly distant and arcane. Her very children, the fruit of this forbidden union, were now declared bastards, robbed of their legitimate birthright, their future clouded by this pronouncement. Elara, once a respected lady, was now a woman whose marriage had been dissolved, her children taken from her, and her status plummeted. She was seen as tainted, her marital history a scandal. She lost all her rights as a wife. Her dowry, though theoretically reclaimable in an annulment based on kinship, often became entangled in legal battles and was rarely fully returned to the woman, especially if her family had already transferred it or was reluctant to support it. Elara was essentially cast out, her status erased, her children gone. She could technically remarry, as the marriage was deemed never to have existed, but her prospects were grim. Who would want a woman whose previous marriage had been annulled for incest, whose children were now illegitimate, and whose family might be seen as careless or complicit in such a scandalous alliance? Elara was often forced to withdraw from society, perhaps into a convent for the rest of her days, where her life would be one of quiet contemplation and spiritual penance, forever marked by the circumstances of her annulment. Her very existence became a testament to the Church's power over marriage and the unforgiving nature of societal judgment, even for an innocent woman caught in the intricate, often cruel, web of medieval kinship laws and political maneuvering. The shame, though not tied to personal transgression, was nonetheless a pervasive and debilitating force in her life. Number 6. Pre-contract or prior engagement. In the complex tapestry of medieval marriage law, the concept of a pre-contract was a significant and often devastating trap for women. Unlike modern engagements, a simple promise of marriage, even if unwritten and unconsummated, could in 1205 be considered a legally binding contract in the eyes of the Church. If a woman had previously exchanged vows, perhaps informally, with one man, and then proceeded to marry another, her second marriage could be declared null and void, as the first, if proven, was the truly valid one. This loophole, while seemingly protecting the sanctity of promises, often led to profound public shame for the woman, accusing her of deception, bigamy, or a lack of moral fortitude, regardless of her true intentions or awareness of the legal implications. Consider the story of Genevieve, a young woman living in a bustling town in Flanders. As a teenager, she had been deeply smitten with a dashing young craftsman, Thomas, who worked in her father's workshop. Their love was innocent, expressed through stolen glances and whispered promises. One evening, under the moonlit sky, they exchanged solemn vows, promising to be husband and wife before God, even though they had no means to marry formally and secretly harbored hopes of escaping their station to build a life together. This private exchange, witnessed only by the stars in their fervent young hearts, was, in the eyes of canon law, a verba de presenti, a promise of marriage in the present tense, making them, technically, married. However, circumstances intervened. Thomas left the town abruptly, seeking his fortune elsewhere, and Genevieve received no news of him. After years passed, and with no word from Thomas, Genevieve's family, eager to secure her future and elevate their social standing, arranged a marriage for her with a much older, wealthy merchant, Lord Henry. Genevieve, believing Thomas to be gone forever or perhaps even dead, and seeing no other recourse, dutifully accepted her fate. She married Lord Henry in a grand public ceremony, and for several years they lived as husband and wife, eventually welcoming children into their home. Then, unexpectedly, Thomas reappeared. He had returned to the town, having made his fortune, and upon discovering Genevieve's marriage, was furious. He still considered her his wife by their earlier, secret contract. Fueled by a sense of betrayal and a desire to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his, he immediately brought a petition before the ecclesiastical court, claiming Genevieve was already bound to him by a prior, valid marriage contract. The trial that ensued was a devastating ordeal for Genevieve. She was forced to admit her youthful indiscretion, her secret vows with Thomas. The court, bound by canon law, had to ascertain the truth of the prior contract. Thomas brought witnesses, distant relatives or old friends, who could attest to their relationship or to conversations where the young couple had declared their intentions. Genevieve found herself caught in an impossible bind. Current marriage, legitimate in the eyes of the world, was now challenged by a secret past. Prior contract was proven valid, her marriage to Lord Henry would be declared null, a mere illusion. The shame that cascaded over Genevieve was immense. She was branded as a deceiver, a woman who had entered a sacred union with a powerful merchant while secretly being bound to another. Community, quick to judge, whispered about her duplicity, her lack of honesty. She was accused of bigamy, a grave sin, even if she had believed Thomas was out of her life forever. Her reputation, once that of a respectable wife and mother, was shattered. Lord Henry, her husband, felt publicly humiliated and betrayed, even if he understood the legal intricacies, and often turned his fury upon her. The court ruled that the prior contract with Thomas was valid. Genevieve's marriage to Lord Henry was annulled, meaning it was considered never to have truly existed. Children with Henry, previously legitimate, were now declared illegitimate, a crushing blow that affected their inheritance and social standing. She lost all her rights to Henry's property and her dowry, which often remained with Henry or her own family, reluctant to take her back. She was then technically bound to Thomas, her first love, but often faced resentment and anger from him as well, as their reunion was forced in public. Genevieve's life was irrevocably ruined. She was stripped of her children, her social standing, and her good name. Even if she eventually lived with Thomas, their relationship was tainted by the scandal. She was forever marked as the woman whose marriage was annulled due to a pre-contract, a stark reminder of the unforgiving nature of medieval legal and social strictures. Her existence became a cautionary tale, a symbol of profound, enduring shame in a world that offered little mercy to women caught in such intricate legal traps. Number 7. Non-consummation or impotence. In the meticulously regulated world of 1205, the validity of a marriage, particularly in the eyes of the Church, was often contingent upon its physical consummation. A marriage was considered a sacred bond, yes, but it was also a union intended for procreation, to be fruitful and multiply. If a marriage remained unconsummated, meaning the couple had not engaged in sexual intercourse, or if the husband was deemed impotent, the wife had a potential, albeit complicated, ground for seeking an annulment. While this might seem like a path to freedom, the very act of bringing such a private, intimate matter into the public arena, and the revelation of such a deeply personal detail, inevitably led to profound humiliation and indelible shame for the woman involved, even if the fault lay with her husband. Consider the case of Lady Isolde, a young woman from a respectable noble family in southern France. Her marriage had been arranged at a young age to Lord Gaston, a man of similar standing, with the express purpose of uniting two estates and, crucially, producing heirs. Isolde, a dutiful bride, entered the marriage with the expectation of fulfilling her wifely duties and becoming a mother. However, as weeks turned into months, and months into a full year, the marriage remained unconsummated. Lord Gaston, it became evident, was physically unable to perform his marital duties. He was impotent, a condition that, in a society obsessed with lineage and virility, was considered a profound failing for a man, but an even greater problem for his wife. Isolde, trapped in a marriage that was effectively a sterile and empty shell, found herself in an agonizing predicament. Primary purpose as a wife was to bear children, and without consummation, this was impossible. Whispers began to circulate within the household and beyond. Servants noticed the lack of a swelling belly, the absence of the typical signs of newlywed bliss. Pressure from both families for an heir mounted, making Isolde's barren state, through no fault of her own, a source of increasing anxiety and suspicion. Eventually, in desperation and after much consultation with her confessor, Father Anselm, Isolde resolved to seek an annulment on the grounds of non-consummation and her husband's impotence. This was not a decision taken lightly. The process of proving non-consummation or impotence was excruciatingly invasive and publicly humiliating. Isolde had to present her case to an ecclesiastical court, usually composed of elderly male clerics. She would be forced to testify, often under oath, about the most intimate details of her marital bed. She might even be subjected to a physical examination by midwives or matrons, a deeply invasive procedure to confirm her virginity and the absence of consummation. Lord Gaston, for his part, would also be subjected to examination, often by physicians and barbers, to determine the nature of his impotence. This public exposure of his private failing would be equally shameful for him, but the larger societal judgment often fell heavier on the woman. The shame for Isolde was overwhelming. The entire community would know the intimate, embarrassing details of her unconsummated marriage. She would be seen as the woman whose husband could not perform, a veiled insult that often implied something was wrong with her or that she was somehow undesirable, even if the legal fault lay with him. people would question her virginity, even if it was proven. Whispers of sorcery or divine disfavor might attach to her, as such a sterile union could be perceived as a curse. Her reputation, once pristine, would be irrevocably tainted by this public airing of such personal matters. Even if Isolde succeeded in obtaining the annulment, and the marriage was declared never to have been valid, her future was still fraught with difficulty. While she would be free to marry again, her past would be a heavy burden. She would be known as the woman from the unfulfilled marriage, the one whose husband was impotent. Prospective suitors might be wary, fearing a similar fate, or simply recoiling from the scandal associated with her name. Her dowry, if not fully returned, would be a source of continued legal dispute. Isolde's life after the annulment would likely be one of quiet obscurity. She might find a new husband, but her public history would forever mark her as a woman who had endured an intimate, deeply humiliating public spectacle. The shame of non-consummation, though stemming from her husband's failing, clung to her like a shroud, a constant reminder of a failed marriage, a public declaration of her barren bed, and the crushing weight of societal judgment. Her very femininity, despite her innocence, would be scrutinized and questioned, leaving her a figure of quiet pity or even suspicion.